to you from Kansas City, Missouri, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government. I'm Lauren Palmer, the Director of Local Government Services for the Mid-America Regional Council, and your host for this episode. GovLove is produced by ELGL, the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network. We engage the brightest minds in local government. You can support GovLove by becoming an ELGL member, so check out elgl.org for incredibly affordable and high-value membership options. Today I'm visiting with Chirs Morrill, Executive Director and CEO, and Shayne Kavanagh, the Senior Manager for Research with the Government Finance Officers Association, probably known better to you as GFOA. We're talking about rethinking budgeting, GFOA's partnership with NLC and ICMA, to consider new thinking, technologies, and practices in budgeting to better meet the challenging needs of communities. Chirs and Shayne, welcome back to GovLove.
Great to be back. Thanks.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, very welcome. You're both alumni guests of GovLove, and we're very excited to hear what new information you have to share with us today. But before we get into our interview, as you both know, we're going to start with a lightning round just to get to know you a little bit better. So, Chirs, I'm going to start with my first question to you. Tell us about your best vacation.
Sure. So best vacation, and it's because of the circumstances. So I was in Peace Corps in Ukraine in '92. Started in the winter, so it was one of the coldest winters in Europe. We had no food. We lived on something called salo, which is smoked pig fat, and cabbage and potatoes for months. And so our first vacation, we get out of the country, we actually took a train to Budapest. And I remembered exiting the train station and seeing fresh fruits and vegetables and restaurants. And so it was extremely memorable.
Yeah, this is incredible. Do you still have contacts there? I mean, with all of the unrest in that country.
I do. I have some of my fellow Peace Corps volunteers stayed and are still there, actually, helping out and supporting folks through the war effort. Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. What a great experience. All right, Shayne, what about you? Tell us about your best vacation.
I would have to say probably Ireland, and kind of the excitement there was reconnecting with family. So we're kind of like a second generation, technically. And so we had sort of lost touch with some of the family on the other side. And so I was given a map and some names by the family genealogist, said, show up in this town, ask around. Maybe you can find some people, and the people in town were super excited to help me do it. And you met a bunch of family members. It was great.
That's very cool. So you met people, they were not expecting you. You just kind of found them.
Definitely not. When I went to town, they're like, you're related to the richest person in town. They own the family hotel. So that was a little weird to show up. Hey, long lost cousin who is the richest person in town. That's not strange at all. But they gave me a map and directed me to all the right people. And the best, one of the best parts was Aunt Bridie up in the hill. She's like, well, she doesn't have a telephone, so you're just gonna have to go up there and knock on the door and hope for the best. So I knock on the door. She looks me up and down like, yeah, all right, we're related. Come in and let's have soda bread.
Wow. What an incredible story. I mean, it takes some courage to just go knock on a stranger's door in a foreign country and say, hi, I'm your family.
Right. No. I'd be lying if I said there weren't pubs involved. So
yeah,
right. Makes it easy.
That helps. All right. Very cool stories from both of you. I can't wait to hear what you have to say on my next question. So Shayne, we're going to let you go first this time. What's your most controversial non-political opinion?
Wow. That's a good question. I don't know. That public finance is the best part of local government.
Super controversial, also predictable. This is like a GovLove oldie but a goodie question. We've started lots of verbal wars over this question. So I don't know. We'll see. I think we'll have some GovLove listeners who maybe take issue, but finance touches everybody, right? It's the tie that binds.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Chirs, what about you? What's your most controversial non-political opinion?
So I grew up outside of Boston. So, big Boston fan. Most of my career has been on the East Coast, but now working for GFOA, I have to say Chicago is the best large city in the United States. It is fantastic.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're going to offend some folks.
Right.
Your background in Boston.
Try again, Chris. That's not controversial. That's just known fact.
Oh.
Oh, so okay. You've got an ally here in this.
Yep.
Love the shout out for the Midwest. Of course, I'm big time loyal to Kansas City. I don't know if you put Kansas City like in the mega city category, but yeah, Chicago's great. I love just a good Midwestern culture vibe.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, great. Especially this time of year. Like love Chicago in the spring, summer.
Yep.
Not as much in the winter. But
That's true. You have to be hardy.
Yeah. You got to be willing to endure the winter. It makes you appreciate the summer more.
Builds character too.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Final question. What's something outside of public finance that you want to study and learn more about? So, Chris, we'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think I've stopped and started several times learning Spanish. I would love to get fluent in Spanish, just for traveling and just living in the U.S. I think I would just love to be able to do that.
Oh, ditto. This would be my answer to that question too. It's like my great regret in life that I never stuck with it after high school and got really fluent. And now I feel like intimidated. I'm too intimidated to like practice with Spanish speakers. Yeah. I agree. All right, Shayne, what's your answer?
Speaking of foreign languages, Python. So I would like to learn to do Python programming. So I figured, like, you know what? We are living in the world of AI and all that good stuff. So kind of knowing that language, I think, would be quite powerful.
Yeah, fascinating. What would you do with it?
Well, I know this is maybe back to predictable public finance, but Python is super integrated with Excel nowadays. So think about Excel spreadsheets taken to the nth level.
Yeah, like Excel on steroids.
Right, exactly.
I like this. Okay, great. Well, appreciate both of you hanging with us through the lightning round. And now we will dive into the heart of our interview. So, Chris, the last time you were a guest on GovLove, it was a minute ago, back in 2017, episode 101 for our listeners who might want to go back and catch that episode. But at that time, you had just started in your role as CEO at GFOA. So maybe you could just remind us a little bit about your background and what led you into this role.
Sure. Yeah. So most of my career was in Savannah, Georgia. I started there as a management analyst. And then the manager took a risk on me and I became budget director at 28. And so budget director in Savannah, left to do Peace Corps, came back to Savannah as assistant city manager, and then left and actually worked in South Africa. I was able to be the Minister of Finance in South Africa as they were building their local government finance system after apartheid, wanted a practitioner. And so I worked there with advisors from all over the world to build the local government finance system in South Africa. Just a fantastic opportunity. Yeah, and then came back to Savannah and then had this opportunity in Roanoke to become city manager. And just loved it here. It was a community that had challenges, but it wanted to try new stuff, and the council was supportive. It was like a perfect storm of really accomplishing stuff. In fact, a plug, it was the cover story for Governing Magazine, their most recently launched issue. That they've gone back to a print edition. And so it's all the cover stories about Roanoke. So did that, and then had this opportunity with GFOA. My predecessor was executive director for 38 years. Doesn't open up very often. Yeah. So while I would have loved a few more years in Roanoke to finish up some projects, had the opportunity to come to GFOA. And I had been a GFOA super member for many years, been on standing committees and been on the board. I'd been president, I did training. GFOA was our consultant for our ERP system in Savannah. So, I was all in. So it's been a fantastic 7 years, a great supportive board. I get to work with really smart, interesting folks like Shayne and, just super engaged members. I can't think of anything better than what I'm doing right now.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for that introduction. Of course, we're going to talk more about what's going on at GFOA, but I didn't realize that you had that international experience. That opportunity in South Africa sounds incredible.
It was incredible because South Africa, under apartheid, everything was centrally controlled. So they really didn't have a
Yeah.
local government system. So if we had the opportunity to create a system from scratch without all the legacy stuff that's been tweaked, imagine that opportunity. So it was pretty exciting. And working with folks who, had been in exile, had been in prison, they were all in, committed to doing it right. So it was a fantastic opportunity.
Yeah, amazing. All right, Shayne, so you are also in the GovLove Alumni Association. You joined the pod back in 2022, episode 491 for our listeners. And at that time, you were talking about rethinking revenues. So for our new listeners, tell us more about the work that you do at GFOA and how you pick your research projects.
Sure. So I am the senior manager of research for GFOA, and I think that, as the name implies, doing a lot of research. And the projects that we pick are, I guess, I would say, driven by member needs and interests. And so, for example, we do member surveys that show what folks are concerned about, and our agenda has been traditionally driven mainly by that. And in more recent years, we have these rethinking projects, right? So you referenced rethinking revenue. Today, we're talking about rethinking budgeting. And, that has been motivated by the fact that we find ourselves in an era of increased volatility, change. And as Chris is mentioning, all that is an opportunity, right? To rethink some of the ways we've used to do things, including revenues, budgeting. And just today, in fact, as of this recording, rethinking financial reporting, we just launched a bunch of new and major content for that initiative. So you can probably see a theme in our current research projects there.
Yeah. So, okay, Shayne, we're talking today about rethinking budgeting. And I have admitted to both of you that I invited you on this podcast from a bit of a skeptical perspective. When I saw that you were working on this project, kind of my instant reaction was like, come on, I've been doing government budgeting for 20 years now. I've seen it all. Zero-based budgeting, priority-based budgeting. Like, what are they up to now? Is there really anything fresh to say about budgets? So, what do you think, Shayne? What's new in budgeting?
Yeah, so I love the way you approach that question, because our organizing premise for the entire Rethinking Budgeting project is we are not the first people to do this. Why should we be involved in this at all, right? In fact, one of our very first publications was answering that question. And the idea is, yeah, people have been complaining about the traditional budget, the line item incremental budget, where last year's budget becomes next year's budget with changes around the margins, pretty much since that type of budget was invented, right? And then you have things like zero-based budgeting. These have been tried, right? So what makes us think that now is an auspicious time to do this? And so there are a few different reasons. One are some of the threats, and we kind of divide into threats and opportunities. And I think the threats would be well known to listeners of this podcast. I probably don't need to spend a ton of time explaining it, but it is things like increasing volatility, uncertainty in the environment, constrained revenues, things like that. There's also the traditional shortcomings of the traditional budget, right? Which is viewed as not strategic, not adaptable to change, like these sorts of things. Again, your members, our listeners have probably heard this all before. So what are the opportunities? That's where I think it becomes much more interesting, right? And so maybe one of the more obvious opportunities is technology, right? Like, so you mentioned zero-based budgeting. And so one of the traditional complaints has been, well, zero-based budgeting is super paperwork intensive, which it is, right? But in the year 2024, nothing should be super paperwork intensive, right? Because things are moved around by electrons, not atoms, right? So there is a big opportunity to use technology where like the marginal cost of producing information goes to zero. The cost of moving information around networks rounds to zero, right? So this like changes a lot of things, right, in the realm of budgeting. But beyond the technology, there's, I think, some other important ideas. You mentioned, again, zero-based budgeting is a rational, comprehensive approach to budgeting, right? We're going to look at the whole budget from the ground up and rebuild every single line item. It is based on this assumption that people are rational, comprehensive thinkers, right? But there's been a lot of research over the years that have shown, and this is probably one of the things that people like least need proven to them, but we have Nobel Prizes on it now, but that people are predictably irrational, right? So we are not rational, comprehensive thinkers. We are think in predictably irrational ways, so we can build decision systems that take into account or that are built around the way people actually make decisions, right? So that's going to lead to a fairly different approach than, like, say, zero-based budgeting. And then probably very much related to that is that we have different mental models. So the traditional budget's built around the win-lose game. And I'm sure many of your listeners have experienced this, where the budget is seen as an exercise. And if I don't get my piece of the pie, someone else will. So I have to compete in the budget game. And the result is eventual financial distress and just stress for the participants involved. Fortunately, there is a large body of work that describes how to have more what I'll call like generative relationships in budgeting and finance and other sort of, we'll call it like shared resource environments. And our work translated all of that to public finance and proved it out using a variety of different case studies. And I'm guessing there's a fair number of, we'll call them government nerds amongst your audience. And so you might like to know that that body of research is called Common Pool Resource Theory, and that is a Nobel Prize winning body of work by Elinor Ostrom. That's and kind of more popularly known as the tragedy of the commons. Like, so that idea of solving the tragedy of the commons and thinking of the budget as the commons that everyone is competing over, and then how do we solve that particular problem. And then the last, I guess, opportunity I will bring up is the idea of fairness in budgeting. So I think in a traditional budget process where it's driven by what happened last year, right, or historical precedent. Historical precedent is the stand-in for fairness. Like, well, we did what we did last year is fine. We're just going to move forward. But I think people have a more nuanced sense of fairness, and that would be, I think, evidenced by increased interest in things like equity. So that would be an example of that. So we have the opportunity to have a more nuanced and comprehensive view of fairness in budgeting.
So you've kind of shared some of the opportunities that you found in your research. Give us the highlights of the bottom line. Like, what are the findings from your research, and how would listeners put them into action?
Sure. So we have really a couple of different lenses on this. So the first, I think, important lens is that one of the mantras of rethinking budgeting is chefs, not cooks. So in other words, you're not going to find a budgeting recipe, right? Like I would call zero-based budgeting a budgeting recipe, right? Like this is how it's done. There's a step-by-step approach of how you can go about this. We provide a set of principles, and the budget officer can then use those set of principles to architect a budgeting process that works for their context. And you may not use all the principles, right? Like just like a chef is not going to use every single ingredient they have at their disposal. Same here, right? Like maybe some principles are a good fit for you and maybe some aren't, or maybe you just don't need to use all of them. And so let's get a little concrete here and give you an example. This is one of my favorite examples from College Station, Texas. So they had a budget process that was self-described as a cloak and dagger affair and as if divined by magic. And so they wanted a different way of going about it. So they kind of took into account a few of the principles that come out of that Common Pool Resource Theory body of work that I mentioned earlier. And one of those is people need to see the group as a group. So in other words, in a traditional budget process, your group is your department, right? And if you have a bunch of people in a room that all see themselves as on separate teams, what are you going to get? You're going to get a competition of team against team. If you have a bunch of people in the room that all see themselves on the same team, you're going to have a very different dynamic. And so how they approach that in College Station is they had all, and I'm going to just kind of give you the highlights here. There's more nuance to how they put this together, but in the interest of time, I'm giving the highlights. Is they had all of the different departments develop their budget proposals, but then they shared the budget proposals amongst all the other departments, and they had a group process to evaluate all the budget proposals together. And so why this was interesting is going into the budget deliberations, the police had a budget proposal for an enhancement to the K9 unit. And it's probably not surprising to a lot of folks that have experience in municipal government where a public safety proposal would be top of the pile. But the police chief going in and like looking at all the other proposals that people put forward came to the realization that, oh, wait, like all these other programs that people are putting forward are not only more important for public safety potentially, I need their support, for other things that I need to do. So if I kind of push my police dog thing through at the expense of these other good programs that people have, I'm not going to be able to have the kind of whole team approach that we really need here in the city. So kind of he gave up the police dogs in favor of some of these other proposals based on that experience. And in fact, lest you think, well, this is a particularly altruistic police chief. I know Chris has had some very similar experiences in Roanoke with the same dynamic.
All right, thanks for that explanation, and shout out to our friends in College Station who are innovating in this work. And apologies to our listeners if you were expecting to hear the rollout of the new acronym and the latest and greatest idea in public budgeting. Like that's not it. I love this idea of chefs, not cooks, that you're really rolling out a series of principles that are meant to look like ingredients and not a really rigid recipe for organizations to follow. I think that really makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, Shayne, I want to ask, is there anything from your prior research on rethinking revenues that influenced your approach to this work on rethinking budgeting?
Yeah, so there is definitely some common themes, I guess. Like, so for example, the idea of taking advantage of the latest in psychological research of how people think. Fairness, like you imagine, in revenues, the idea of fairness and how revenues are raised is super important. And also just how to manage shared resources. Like this is a common theme across all areas of public finance, not just budgeting. So there are definitely some commonality synergies. So if you're following both bodies of work, you will not be in for a case of whiplash.
Mm-hmm. Great. You mentioned this idea of people being predictably irrational. Can you give kind of a concrete example of how organizations might use these new, what did you call it, mental models?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To overcome that irrationality?
Sure. Yeah. So a really kind of, I think, straightforward one is this idea of the overconfidence bias. So people are generally overconfident about a lot of things, but one of the, I would call it like consequences of this is we tend to underestimate the amount of uncertainty that's in the future. So a way to kind of think about this, put some numbers on it, because I am from the Government Finance Officers Association, is that people estimates of the future, if you ask them to put a quantitative range on it, like, what do you think revenues will be, just for example, in the future, the range they will give you will be usually about 50% narrower than a statistical analysis would produce. So just to give you a real life example of this, we were working with one city where we're helping them evaluate their vulnerability to natural catastrophes from a financial perspective. And so we did the math statistically based on wildfires in the region. Then we asked the fire department to help us with their own estimates and their judgmental estimates. And the estimates from the fire department were about 50% narrower than the statistical range, right? So like it's kind of proof of this concept, and it's been replicated in many fields. So that's not just GFOA's 50%. That's like many different places. And so that's actually useful validation, because if you double the firefighter's range, you get the statistical range, which means things match up. But the point being here, that would be an example of a predictably irrational cognitive bias. And so what does this have to do with budgeting? Is it tends to, one of the practical implications, you tend to have a narrow framing on issues. So things are either or types of solutions, and you miss like the both and type possibilities. So a budget officer, when they're architecting a budget process, can encourage widening the option sets to look beyond these either or types of solutions. And to kind of bring it down to a very practical level, I'm sure many of the folks in your audience here are familiar with what I'll call the crisis card budget game. Like, hey, either we spend money on this thing or the town like basically sinks into the ocean or whatever, like, right? So that is the ultimate either or narrow framing solution. And there's probably more than one way to solve whatever the public safety problem is that is being referred to, right? So like, it doesn't have to be don't do nothing or do the thing that's being put forward as the option. It could be, hey, let's explore some other ways to solve this problem. Maybe these other ways are more efficient or more economical or what have you, right? So these are just that'd be an example of how to recognize where these predictably rational ways of behavior are operative and what you can do to turn that information into useful action.
Yeah, it's really powerful. Chris, I know that this month, the GFOA Board of Directors will consider your final report of the Rethinking Budgeting Project. So, what's next? How does GFOA plan to operationalize this research?
Sure. Yeah. So we're excited. This has really been a 3-year process, engaged lots of members, academics, foundations. And we have some great data there. So currently, GFOA's official policy on local government budgeting is called the Recommended Budget Practices from the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting, which was adopted in 1998 and is much more of the cook, not the chef. It's the recipe. And so, what we'll be asking the executive board to do is to adopt a new operating system, which is this rethinking budgeting system, which won't be a fixed thing. You know, as we learn and experiment and hear from members, it'll continue to grow. So, with this new operating system of rethinking budgeting, we'll then, with that approval, we'll then work on updating the apps. And so our apps would include our best practices, the budget awards program, all the training and education that we do. And so that's what we'll be working on over the next 12 to 18 months and ongoing. As I said, we think this will continue to evolve. There'll be more research on behavioral science and ways we can apply that. And so, but that key concept is really that, this won't be something prescriptive. It will be, looking at the budget officer as a chef, not a cook.
Mm-hmm. So if it's not prescriptive, it's kind of tough to know when you're getting it right. Shayne, you gave us that great example from College Station. Are there any other really practical examples of how you have seen local governments effectively implement one or more of the rethinking budgeting principles?
Yeah, so I would like use another example, and we'll go with this is actually another approach to the crisis card popped to mind since I was just talking about the crisis card. So this is another system where they had used the principle of seeing everyone on the same team, but then they added to that a couple others. So there's this idea of making the system transparent, and transparency has kind of become a bit of almost I don't say a meaningless term in some ways because we say it so often that we sometimes forget what it actually means in some ways. But in this case, it was we're going to just have everyone in the same room making decisions so we all know who is proposing what. And we are also, and this is where it is really interesting, this idea of having incentives involved in the system, so penalties and rewards. And so in local government, you don't really have financial penalties and rewards, right? Like you might in a private corporation. But what do we have? We do have peer approval, and that's kind of a big deal, especially if you see yourself as a member of the team. So in this particular local government, someone tried to play the crisis card, and they had enough trust and open communication, which is another one of the principles, that the other team members felt comfortable saying, you're trying to game us, right? We're not going to play that game. And if you see yourself on the same team and you just got rejected by your peers, right? Because if see yourself on a different team, that's not rejection from a peer, that's another team trying there to play against you. But getting that peer disapproval is a powerful lever, right, to change behavior. So I think that's a really good example of having you can have self-regulating systems. So it's not a case of the budget officer needing to basically play the goalie while everyone else tries to kick the ball past the budget officer. You have this self-monitoring, self-regulating system in place.
And I would say we also hope that through using these tools and resources and principles that we can see trust begin to increase, both internally among the departments, but also externally with the public. If you think about the critical role that a budget plays, and does your resource allocation reflect your values? And so we're really hoping with this we can maybe start addressing some of that decline in trust that we all are experiencing working at the local level.
So that's interesting to hear you say, Chris. This is GFOA. You guys are the numbers and the math people, and here you are talking about public trust. Say more about that. How that public trust element really fits into public budgeting.
Yeah, Shayne, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, like I would say, like our code of ethics, the kind of headline of it is trust is our most valuable asset. Because it's true, right? Like if no one believes your numbers, like it doesn't matter what numbers you put there, right? People have to believe it, and they have to believe not only that the numbers, but that you're a good steward of public finance, and how that happens is building trust, right? So it's really foundational to the entire thing. In fact, when people often ask me, like, "Oh, public finance, tell me about that," I'm like, "Well, you would think it's a math problem. It's not really a math problem. It's a psychological, like endeavor. That's really kind of a lot what is what is so important about this work is keeping trust, not only inside the organization, but as Chris mentioned, outside the organization with the public.
All right.
So,
go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So we talk about the finance officer, her role, if you think of it in terms of, I'm going to help build trust in the organization and in the community, you then approach it differently. It's not just about spreadsheets. It's really about designing processes, public engagement, how you use data, the data that you choose to use, with the goal to not only build a strong financial foundation that all your services can then be resilient and rest on, but also to build trust in the community.
Makes a lot of sense. You all teed up the perfect segue for my next question. I'm going to pivot away from budgeting for a minute and give you an opportunity to just talk a little bit more about GFOA. So I'm going to tee this up by telling you, I was at an event recently. The audience was primarily city managers, and there was a panel of 3 panelists of people who had been involved with the Local Government 2030 initiative. So 2 delegates and a super delegate. And in the course of that conversation, those panelists shared that they felt like much of the creative thinking and leadership in the Local Gov 2030 process was coming from GFOA, which I found was fascinating for them to say in a room full of city managers. So I would love to hear from you, like, what is GFOA doing right to garner that kind of high praise?
Well, first, thanks so much for sharing that. As you can imagine, that makes us feel really good because that's what we hope. And shout out to the Local Government 2030 initiative. It's fantastic what they're doing, and hopefully, and we want to continue to support that. But I think for us, we're able to be really creative because we have a supportive environment. Our executive board, allows us to take risk. We have, great staff, folks like Shayne and good thinkers, and we have really engaged members. There's something about finance people that they just love this stuff, and so when we can both, partner with academics and with our members, so we can have practical research, it helps. And then I think our approach, we approach our work with a lot of humility, realizing we don't have the answers. However, if we can build strong partnerships with other associations, with the academic community, with our engaged members, then we're going to come to better solutions. And so I think that's really, that mindset has allowed us to do some really creative stuff. And I think it gets us, to work every day and committed to this type of work that we do. I know, Shayne, if you have you've been with GFOA a lot longer than I have.
I would just echo that. And I would think, one thing I always enjoy is we work with a lot of outside folks, because GFOA is a network, right? Like that is where the power comes from. And as a network, like we connect with other folks, and we try to connect with folks outside as well as inside. I'd call it the local government space. And so we connect with a lot of folks outside local government space. And something I like routinely hear is like, wow, your members are amazing. And just to give you like an example on rethinking budgeting, we've got, I think Chris mentioned, like 30 some odd folks that volunteered. Just like we sent a message, hey, who'd like to volunteer for a 3-year project? Right. And we got like plenty of people to like fill that out. It wasn't a problem. But like just the other day, right, like we did a survey, and like one of the members is like, hey, can I analyze the survey for you? I'm like, you can. Like, so
Really?
Point being is like we have an amazing membership and our power comes from them.
Awesome. Since you're talking about networks, like shameless plug to get engaged in your professional association, if that's GFOA or something else, and definitely get involved in ELGL. Like those networking opportunities are so important for professional development.
And I do a plug for ELGO. I mean, I think from the beginning of ELGO, I was involved as a city manager, and now with GFOA, it's just great stuff like this and making this fun and accessible. I mean, you play a really critical role in our network. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. All right. Well, Chris, if you had any advice for our listeners who want to learn more and incorporate this research into their budgets, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. I'd say go to gfoa.org and go to our Rethinking Budgeting resource page. And you'll find, I mean, we probably have 25 different research reports. We have government finance review articles. We have case studies. It's just kind of get there and dabble and see if something strikes your interest. Some of my favorites are power, politics, and budgeting. Don't hate the players. Don't hate the game. Change the game. Really well done. It's a fun read. The budget officer is decision architect. Some of the stuff we've done around behavioral science, around polarization, especially in the stuff that we're dealing with. So just kind of look through there, find something that strikes your interest, and I think it's going to make you want to delve into more. And then look at some things that you can incorporate and some systems, and then just stay engaged with us. We will continue this dialogue. We'll continue to learn. Share with us your experience if you try some of these, so we can continue to have that learning community that we want. Shayne, would you agree?
I would agree wholeheartedly, and I also mentioned, as Chris mentioned earlier in our podcast, that part of our work will be apps, to go with the operating system. One of the apps we just are actually finishing up our pilots on is a self-assessment tool. So Chris mentioned figure out kind of where the best spot is to dip your toe, and I could not agree more. And the self-assessment tool will be a great way to help you figure out where ought to I dip my toe in this pool.
Yeah. Well, you have both capably countered my skepticism about this topic. It turns out there is a lot of fresh things to say about rethinking budgeting, and you have really challenged my thinking with talking about the psychology of budgeting and kind of moving beyond this math equation of balancing your budget and really thinking about the psychology of how we make those public policy decisions. So thank you for that. I'm eager to go look at your website and learn more about those things. Is there anything else that either of you want to share before we wrap up?
Not here, but just thank you again for having us on the podcast and giving us the opportunity to speak to your listenership.
Yeah, Lauren, really appreciate it. We know your listeners are probably the most engaged, enthusiastic, and so thank you for this opportunity to get some of our research out in front of them.
Thank you. We do have the best listeners of all podcasts of all time. So you are really talking to the cream of the crop here. We do so much appreciate you taking the time to come and share your Rethinking Budgeting research with us. Before we wrap up, Shayne, we're going to let you answer our final question. If you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as our exit music for this episode?
So I go through
no pressure.
No, none taken. And I'm go through phases. I'm going through an 80s synth pop phase right now.
Oh, okay.
So something by New Order.
Oh, what a throwback. I love it. Something. You don't have a specific song? We're going to
I'm enjoying many New Order songs right now, and also Depeche Mode. So I would go with one of those.
Gosh.
Tainted Love.
There you go.
Yes. Okay, I cannot wait to see what our production team comes up with. This is going to be some good music that I have not listened to in a while. It'll be fun. All right, that ends our episode for today. Thanks so much to our guests, Chirs Morrill and Shayne Kavanagh from GFOA. And to our audience, thank you for listening. You can reach us at elgl.org/GovLove or on social media at GovLove Podcast. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.